The fighting at Leningrad was relentless, and the city was completely cut off from the outside world due to an effective German and Finnish encirclement in late 1942. Moreover, the Soviet civilians and soldiers were starving and had no more ammunition or war assets. Most of the populace would have to endure the harsh winters and the brutal close-quarters combat until help arrived, if it ever came. Under these extreme circumstances, the Soviet army launched Operation Iskra in January of 1943 to break through the German encirclement and relieve the city with valuable supplies. The fate of Leningrad and its people now depended on the success of this desperate operation. Siege of Leningrad. The capture of the city that bore the name of Soviet leader Vladimir Lenin was one of the main strategic objectives of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. Leningrad was of enormous political and military significance for several reasons. First, it was the former capital of the Russian Empire, and the location where the sparks of Bolshevism ignited for the first time. Second, it was renamed Leningrad in honor of Comrade Lenin, the new hero of the Russian people. If the city was captured, Adolf Hitler and his top brass were convinced that it would be an immediate moral knockdown for the Soviet Red Army. More importantly, Leningrad was the main base of operations for the Soviet battle fleet, where almost 12% of the Soviet industrial output was located. When Operation Barbarossa was unleashed in the summer of 1941, Leningrad was the main target of Army Group North, commanded by the renowned Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb. It is said that Adolf Hitler intended to raze the city to the ground and give portions of it to the Finnish allies. Whichever the case, Army Group North advanced without mercy through the Soviet Union to reach its objective. By August 30th, the Heer had captured Narva, Kingisepp, and Kudovo, cutting off the rail link between Moscow and Leningrad. As the German and Finnish forces began to form a blockade around the city, the Council of Deputies of Leningrad desperately organized civilian response groups to fortify the city and prepare for combat. But despite building several defensive lines, the Luftwaffe bombardments led to chaos. By September of 1941, with support from Italian, Spanish, and Finnish troops, Army Group North began to choke Leningrad to drain it out of vital resources. Sinyavino Offensive. After more than 6 months, the Red Army began to prepare the Sinyavino Offensive to relieve Leningrad in the autumn of 1942. The 2nd and 8th Shock Armies were to link up with the Soviet resistance at the city. However, the Soviets were unaware of the Heer's Northern Light operation, whose purpose was to launch another offensive to link up with Finnish forces and capture the city. The first stage of the Soviet offensive began on August 19th with the Leningrad Front, which was followed by the Volkhov Front 2 weeks later. Over 190,000 Soviet soldiers stormed the sector and successfully prevented the Germans from counterattacking. Still, the 2nd Shock Army was encircled and destroyed, and after almost 2 months of bitter fighting, the Soviet relief effort had failed at the cost of some 40,000 soldiers compared to the 24,000 from the Heer. Moreover, their ammunition and equipment were very scarce. The Soviet operation also became the first sighting of the fearsome Tiger I heavy tanks, which proved their worth in combat against Soviet armor. But unfortunately for the Germans, one of their brand new Tigers was captured by the Soviets and taken to Moscow for immediate inspection. As for Leningrad, its defenders still held their ground, and Field Marshal Lieb realized that a more significant Axis force was required to surrender the city at a faster pace. Following this costly failure, Joseph Stalin ordered a quick second relief effort, and preparations began almost immediately. 2 months later, 20 Soviet divisions were finally ready to break into the Leningrad sector and liberate the city at all costs. Operation Spark. Following the unsuccessful Sinyavino offensive, the Heer stabilized the Leningrad front line again. Almost 16 kilometers separated Kirill Meretskov's Volkhov front and Leonid Gorovov's Leningrad front. The two Soviet forces were scattered and decimated. Still, by January of 1943, they were ready for another attack with overwhelming force. Making the most out of the Wehrmacht's imminent defeat at Stalingrad, the Soviet High Command executed Operation Iskra, or Spark, to deal one decisive blow to Army Group North and liberate Leningrad. When it was inevitable that Germany would not be able to do anything to reinforce the troops at Stalingrad, the Red Army made the last preparations to launch Operation Spark. The Soviet command asked that, quote, "With the combined efforts of the Volkhov and Leningrad fronts, defeat the enemy in the area of Lipka, Gaitolovo, Dubrovka, Shishilberg, and thus penetrate the Leningrad blockade. Finish the operation by the end of January 1943. The objective was to open a 10-kilometer corridor to supply Leningrad. Once this goal was achieved, the USSR would resume operations to advance southward and cut off the Axis forces. During the past Sinyavino offensive, the Volkhov and Leningrad fronts attacked from the south of the town of Sinyavino, which left them vulnerable to attacks from the north and ultimately led to their defeat. To prevent being flanked by the enemy, this time the two fronts would attack from the north, near the shore of Ladoga Lake. The area around Ladoga Lake had a dense forest with peat deposits. Although the wetlands made it difficult for vehicles and artillery to cross it effectively, it was perfect for concealing the infantry. Here are fortifications. Knowing that another offensive was imminent to break the blockade, Army Group North had taken the necessary precautions to fortify the sector. The Heer seized control of the Sinyavino Heights, which were located a few kilometers from the southern shore of Lake Ladoga and almost 60 kilometers east of Leningrad. Most of the terrain surrounding the Sinyavino Heights was more than 140 meters higher than the flat area, which made it an excellent asset to attack. Additionally, Heer engineers built an interconnected series of tunnels, trenches, and other obstacles to halt the advancing enemy troops. Artillery pieces, mortars, and machine gun nests were tactically placed to maximize range and damage the attackers. The decision to go on the defensive was mandatory for the Heer, and 26 divisions were stretched thin in a front more than 450 kilometers wide. In the end, there were no reserves left, besides portions of the 5th Mountain Division, and only 5 divisions guarded the 16-kilometer-long corridor that separated Kirill Meretskov's Volkhov front and Leonid Govorov's Leningrad front. The corridor was dubbed the Bottleneck, and was the only line of defense that prevented the two Red Army forces from linking up and disrupting the German siege. Attacking the Bottleneck. Major General M.P. Dukhanov and Lieutenant General V.Z. Romanovsky were tasked with spearheading the offensive with the Volkhov's Front's 2nd Shock Army and the Leningrad Front's 67th Army. Besides providing fresh infantry, engineer, and artillery units, the Soviet forces received 4 Arasani battalions and 3 ski brigades. To prevent the Germans from flanking the advancing Soviet troops, Lieutenant General F.N. Starakov's 8th Army would lead a limited offensive to disrupt the enemy garrison. Meanwhile, over 800 aircraft from the 13th and 14th Air Armies would provide air support to the infantry. The Red Army was expected to launch the attack on January 1st. Still, poor ice conditions did not freeze the Neva River as expected and delayed the operation. Days later, the rising hero of the USSR, Georgy Zhukov, arrived in the region to analyze the battlefield and the attack plans. Finally, during the night of January 11th, the infantry and tank brigades approached their starting positions to launch the offensive. As they moved, the soldiers heard the roaring engines of Red Army night bombers that raced through the pitch-black sky to attack German artillery positions and communication centers. The preliminary artillery bombardments began at 9:30 a.m. on January 12th. Some minutes before the artillery barrage ceased and the Katyushas rained fire on the Germans, the two Soviet fronts started marching. The offensive to relieve Leningrad had begun. Spearhead assault. The clash between the opposing armies was almost immediate. As soon as the Soviet infantry left the tree line and their concealed positions, the German artillery began to pummel it with accurate rounds. Still, the Red Army's advance was relentless. The infantry and engineers took cover behind their tanks and kept advancing until they reached safer ground. The coordinated attack on the Bottleneck from the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts began to pay off during midday, and both forces broke through the German defensive lines. Still, the 138th and 268th Rifle Divisions from the Leningrad front were able to capture a bridgehead that was over 3 kilometers deep and 5 kilometers wide. Tanks and artillery then poured in and established a defensive line to prevent the Wehrmacht from reconquering it. Then, as night settled on the horizon, Soviet sappers built additional bridges to speed up the advance of echelon troops crossing the Shishilberg River. Although the ultimate cost was high, the Leningrad front was now in German-controlled territory and one step closer to linking up with the Volkhov front, which had encountered stiff resistance on its side. Meanwhile, the Second Shock Army had managed to penetrate the enemy defenses, except for 2 strongpoints located at Lipka and Settlement Number 8. More than 1,000 German defenders resisted inside these strongpoints and were willing to give up their lives. Still, the Heer deployed all its reserves to reinforce the 170th and 227th Infantry Divisions during the night. Besides the much-required infantry, some artillery pieces and 4 lethal Tiger Is also arrived to support the defenders. Pushing forward. The morning of January 12th was greeted by intense artillery fire from both armies across the 2 fronts. The territorial gain was a slow and costly task, given the tenacity of the outnumbered German garrisons. Still, the Soviet forces steadily marched forward, taking small pockets of land as the days passed. The Red Army fighters attacked as vigorously as they could, but foul weather sometimes limited their efforts. Meanwhile, all the German attempts to regain territories were halted after the Red Army quickly reinforced every conquered area with new units. The Heer then began to move portions of units to reinforce sectors about to be lost. The 5th Mountain Division and the SS Police Division were some of them. On the other side, the Soviets deployed the 12th Ski Brigade to cross Ladoga Lake and attack the rear lines, speeding up the link-up process. As such, scattered Teutonic garrisons were cut off and forced to surrender. By January 17th, more settlements had fallen under Soviet control, and the bottleneck had grown thinner. Gorovov was then promoted to Colonel General. Linking up. During the morning of January 18th, units from the 372nd and 123rd Rifle Divisions linked up for the first time near one of the captured German strongpoints. The German units located in the northern portion were completely cut off and surrounded by the Red Army, and all Heer attempts to break through were futile. Only a few units were able to break through the concealed forested area after they left all of their heavy equipment behind. From January 18th to January 21st, the combined forces of both fronts attacked the encircled Wehrmacht garrisons to secure the entire region. Still, the new front line was stabilized after January 21st, and neither the Soviets nor the Germans attempted another assault. USSR workers and soldiers quickly started to link the rail line that went from Leningrad to the rest of the Soviet Union through the captured corridor. And by February 6th, trains began to deliver much-needed supplies to continue fighting the German forces at Leningrad. Thank you for watching our video. Please like and subscribe to our Dark Documentaries channels, where you'll find more exciting historical content. And don't forget to hit the bell icon to be notified of our newest videos. Stay tuned.